happy to have people tuning in from all over the world, and we'll give them a show too. We're going to be using Slido a lot more today too, so those of you who have smartphones, get ready to go to slido.com and put in the hashtag GFI4SD for our conference and get your questions in. Ditto to the live stream audience. And if you don't have a smartphone or you want some help with Slido, just raise your hand and our wonderful volunteers wearing blue in the back will come over to you and make sure that you get in. We were trending #1 in Germany yesterday on Twitter. That's a big deal. And not only is it a big deal, at some point I heard that we were just below hashtag Happy Birthday Justin Bieber. You guys, we were like right up there with the Biebs. So that is huge. Keep tweeting today. Remember, our handle is @GlobalFestIdeas. The hashtag, again, you know, and you can use that across all the platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, the ones I'm not young enough to know anymore. Keep going. Remember to also visit the live stage. We had a lot of fun on the live stage yesterday, and there were tons of people watching, and those talks will live for a long time as well. So please keep going out there. It's straight out there. The Knowledge and Innovation Fair was very well attended yesterday. Keep going out to visit those guys. And keep playing 2030 Hive Mind. How many of you are like loving the game? That's not going to work. We're going to love it even more this morning because we're going to dive even deeper. And finally, do you remember the postcard conversation we had yesterday? Some of you will, some of you won't. We were this is what you were meant to do, is drop your DHL postcards from your bag into the DHL yellow mailbox outside. And then we went to check the mailbox, you guys. And do you see on the left what was in there? We had 12 postcards. We are not going to achieve these SDGs if I give you jobs to do and then only 12 of you do them. So I'm going to assume that it was my bad instructions that put us in that stead. And I'm going to say again that in all your bags there was this DHL postcard. And on the back of it, there are 2 questions. Greetings from the Global Festival of Ideas for Sustainable Development 2017 in Bonn. In 2030, I want to live in a world where. So what do you want the future to look like? And then, by this time next year, to create this world, I will. So what is your personal commitment to achieving the future that you want to see? Then you're going to fill this out, you're going to drop it in the lovely DHL mailbox, and a year from now, it's going to come back to you in the mail. And you can see how accountable you've been, and if you've been accountable, then you will be in good stead to hold our governments accountable, and everybody else in this room. So that mailbox better be full by the end of this day, or you're going to have some sorting out. And I'm not even joking. I'm the eldest of 4 children, so it'll happen. So those are all your assignments and all our announcements. Hopefully we're in good shape, and we have a few final stragglers come in, so we'll give them a chance to sit. And now on to the agenda for this morning. It's going to be a pretty amazing morning, I think. Our plenary this morning is in 3 parts. We'll start with Kumi Naidoo, who was meant to be in conversation with Paula Caballero, but unfortunately Paula has fallen ill. We are sending her love. She's here and I'm sure watching us this morning. So I will sit in for Paula and chat with Kumi, and hopefully we'll make that a great conversation. Then we'll have a session on communicating the SDGs effectively to all, which I think is actually going to be brilliant. And finally, Ishbel and some folks from her team are going to give us a recap of 2030 Hive Mind, and I'm going to chat with them a little bit to hopefully give you guys some more insight into how to play the game if you haven't been all in as yet. And for those of you who have been playing, we'll have some folks up here for you to ask questions and geek out a little. So that will be a lot of fun. And then we'll be breaking for coffee at 10:30. So without further ado, I am so delighted to be leading this conversation with South African human rights activist Kumi Naidoo. Kumi was International Executive Director of Greenpeace until December 2015, and he is currently Director of the launch team at Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. Some of you will have seen his live stream talk yesterday, which was brilliant, and hopefully we'll be able to carry on with that this morning. We are also going to try to get some Slido in to this session, so we're going to chat for 15 or 20 minutes, and then, assuming you guys have all asked good questions, we'll turn it over to you. So feel free to start Slidoing as soon as we sit down. And with that, Kumi. So I kind of have to say that for a lot of us, Kumi needs no introduction, because you've had one of these careers that spanned just the entire SDG landscape to some extent. From the Global Campaign Against Poverty all the way to Greenpeace. And at GCAP in particular, you played a key role in mobilizing civil society around the MDGs, the precursor to the SDGs. So you've been living this, and you see this 17-goal agenda, I think, as holistically as most people possibly can. That being said, I'd love to see your perspective, or hear your perspective from a high level about how the goals interact with each other. And in particular, a lot of our conversation has centered around driving economic growth, but at the same time, promoting and advancing sustainability. So how do those two goals interact with each other? And what's your perspective, having had this kind of SDG focus in life, never mind on this agenda in particular?
Thank you, Nadira. Good morning, everybody. So the big question is, what kind of growth are we talking about? Because the current growth model, unless we're in deep denial, is completely broken. For every $1 that's made in the global economy, 93 cents goes to the top 1% in the world. We have to recognize that part of whether the SDGs succeeds or not is whether, in fact, we are courageous enough to go beyond the words that are there to look at the actual intention behind it and what we need to deliver on. Kofi Annan, when the MDGs was out, eventually was saying, you know, the MDGs is the minimalist development goals, right? A appropriate sort of recognition that, in fact, it was not as ambitious as we needed to be. And people in the feminist movement, when I was saying to people we need to mobilize around the MDGs, were saying, you know what MDGs stand for is a massive diversionary gimmick from where activism should be.
Oh my.
So you need to know that even with the SDGs right now, it all depends on what interpretation we give to the different goals. So for example, if we go on the growth agenda in the way that we conventionally actually do, we will actually burst our carbon budget. We will ensure that meaning that we will warm the planet up to a point where irreversible climate change is our reality. So we have to begin to go back to basics, recognize that the growth model that we've had doesn't work and cannot work. And we also have to recognize that today, when we're thinking about growth, we have to actually connect the conversation about growth with some basic things, such as what constitutes happiness, what constitutes a decent life. And unfortunately, I think today we have a problem in the world where we are suffering from a terrible, powerful disease called affluenza, where enough is never enough for a handful of people. And if you look at it from a developing country perspective, certainly from Africa, I would say Africa has been funding the overconsumptive patterns, not just Africa, but the developing world has been funding the overconsumption that we see in the north. You know, when people say Africa is a poor continent, it really makes us angry, because Africa actually is the richest continent underneath the ground, and precisely because of that, we are one of the poorest continents above the ground. And just to Donald Trump, I must say that if we built a wall around Africa, the whole world would go out of business. So, but just to conclude that, in fact, we are sitting in a very historical moment. The choices that we make now is critically important. And I want to conclude this first intervention with a note of optimism. And that is, you would have heard people like myself, and I'm sure some of you in this room at some point in the last 10 years has used the phrase or thought the phrase, we need to save the planet. The good news, my dear brothers and sisters, the planet does not need saving. Because if we continue on the overconsumptive path of a growth model that just doesn't work for the majority of people on the planet, the end result will be we'll warm the planet up to a point where our water resources will be gone, our land resources will be gone, we won't be able to plant food, we'll warm the planet up where we cannot live, and the end result is we will be gone, the planet actually will still be here. And actually, once we are extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will recover, so on. So don't worry about saving the planet. Yeah. Understand the struggle that we're in, and that is why we need to have the courage to make the changes in our economy to be more just, more equitable, and more sustainable, because the struggle we are engaged in is essentially whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist in a mutually interdependent relationship with nature for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's future, and there can be nothing more important than that. So however big the changes we need to make to bring alignment between economic development and sustainability, we should have the courage to do it.
But it's okay to clap. You're allowed to clap. And in my family, we say we're not killing the earth, we're killing ourselves, right? Okay. And I think it's important for us to underscore that. And I've had a whole list of questions based on how fabulous Kumi is, but now you've said things that made me go in a completely different direction. So get ready, we're freestyling now. Because I'm fascinated by this idea of the SDGs being the minimalist development goals, and then at the same time this notion that we have to get back to basics because we have a serious communication challenge with the people who are supposed to be driving these movements and these changes. So how do we put those two things together? How do we simultaneously communicate the dire situation that we're in, but do it in a way that resonates with average people? And by average, I mean all of us, right? Even we are above average at this point because we're all clearly obsessed with development.
Well, you'll be surprised as where I'm going to place my first challenge is on civil society. And two of the biggest challenges we face in the world is the climate crisis and the financial crisis, or the financial system. But if you look at those of us in civil society, and I'm putting myself in that category, the way we talk about these issues, we play into a trap that locks out about 99% of the people from the conversation. Just very simply, when I landed at Greenpeace, 7 years ago, when Copenhagen was happening, all the messaging, not just of Greenpeace, but the main people in the climate movement was save the climate, save the planet, reduce emissions, and so on. And I was looking at this, and I come from a working class background, so I kept thinking about my aunts and my uncles and my family. Yeah. If they were reading these banners, would they have any sense of what we were talking about? So part of what we need to, firstly, they are complex, and those with power like to keep it complex, right? And the challenge for civil society is to start talking like human beings about these issues. We have to be able to actually talk in a way where we are not projecting our own consciousness on people, but we're actually humbling ourselves and understanding where people are, and actually starting with a language and an approach that builds on what people know. It's not being paternalistic, it's not being simplistic, it's being a good organizer, right? The second challenge we have is the global media environment, right? We must be clear that today we have a global media environment that is corporatized. There is a lot of cross-ownership. If you take Russia, for example, Gazprom, which is one of the main fossil fuel companies, is one of the biggest owners in media. You look at the United States and you look at fossil fuel interests and you look at media ownership, you're seeing the same thing. So if you want to succeed with the the SDGs moving forward, we have to make space to challenge the need for us to have a much more diverse media environment where people actually are getting a much more diverse set of views. The third problem we have is the capture of many of our governments by the very interests that drive environmental destruction generally, as well as climate change specifically. And I can go country by country, starting with my own in South Africa, showing how, in fact, national policy making on the parts of democratically elected governments is completely dominated by powerful players in the energy sector, because energy is seen as a national security imperative and so on. Because you think about it, no government wants the lights to be off, no government wants the cars not to run or the buses not to run and so on. And that gives it an amazing power. So part of it is, because I think, I would say about the SDGs, it has to celebrate, defend, and promote democracy, meaningful democracy, because today, we must be blunt about it. we are in denial that most of what we call democracies are actually not democracies. I mean, I would describe the United States at best as a liberal oligarchy, where it has the form of democracy without the substance of democracy. And you take that and look in the African continent, the countries in Europe and who have longer democratic traditions, their approach is, if a country has an election, however flawed that election was, however few people voted, however people were manipulated, irrespective of the number of people who were killed, a box is ticked. Oh, they had the election, so they have democracy. So part of winning the SDGs has to be trying to defend democratic space, because if there is, people are not stupid, right? People are not stupid, however our political leaders might think. But if you constantly are constraining the space of how people can associate, assemble, and express themselves, and to have meaningful public debates, then you make it very, very difficult. Now, the last thing I would say is also people's self-interest. We have also been addicted to types of consumption that actually, I would argue, do not really enhance the quality of human life, but we have come to believe that certain things we have to have, or certain things. And by the way, this disease of affluenza doesn't only afflict the rich, it also afflicts the poor. The poor's, there are people in my country, for example, who love to see certain of our politicians living in houses that they will never, in their wildest dreams, get to, drive the cars that in the wildest dreams they won't get to. So there is a real consciousness-raising thing that has to be done. And then we have to look at the opportunity. Because I believe that if we are going to address the challenge of meaningful economic development in a context of sustainability, then we need a transition from an economy that's driven by dirty, brown, fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by clean, green, renewable-based energy, what some of us have called an energy revolution. That energy revolution has to be on a scale of the Industrial Revolution or bigger, right? It means completely rethinking our buildings, how well it's insulated. If we said in every country we are going to, in the next 10 years, make sure that our buildings are as energy efficient as possible, that would give us a boost in the construction industry. And I'm going to use a bad example now, but like, you know, there's some top cities in Europe, Uppsala and Bristol, to just take two examples. They run their buses on human feces, in some cultures known simply as shit, right?
You heard it here first.
Okay. And I had some experience of seeing these in operation. And so back home I say to people in Africa, where, by the way, disposing of human waste is a problem for us, right? So I say, well, you know, if places in Europe can actually get their act together to process human feces and run their buses on it, why can't we? And I said, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We just have to get our shit together. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. And the truth is, there is an opportunity here, because we need to almost build our societies from bottom up. From every aspect we should be looking. And I choose these examples because we don't talk about it much. So it's really about recalibrating. And yesterday there were some speakers, I forget the person's name, who was the advocate for gender yesterday, who said the SDGs is a revolution, right? I want to say, let's treat the SDGs as a revolution. But let the revolution be a revolution with a big R, and not the smallest R possible.
So, thought experiment, because that all resonates, and I think it especially resonates in this room. Is there, how many of you remember the statistic that Kumi said first, who did not know it before? The very first thing that essentially came out of your mouth. Is there anybody who remembers?
Yeah. 93 cents of every dollar go to the top 1%.
Which is fantastic. The interesting thing about that is, even in this room, maybe 10 hands went up at most, where that stuck, right? Who actually heard that thought, that is staggering. I should emblazon it in my brain and share it with people out in the universe who would be shocked by that number. And I'm curious about that because you speak very passionately about how we communicate this, the reality of what needs to happen out there. But I think sometimes people don't understand from a granular perspective how we actually do that. Yes, the revolution, big R, has to happen at every level. And yes, we need for these numbers and these ideas to stick. But if in a room of people who are all committed to this, even for us it doesn't sometimes stick. And we don't understand how important and how dire and how critical it is to kind of communicate in a way that resonates with people. How do we actually make the big R revolution? Easy question.
Can I pretend to be Nadira for a moment and pose a question to you?
Yeah.
How many of you, if I say 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, means something to you? You understand what that is? Please raise your hands. Don't feel shy if you don't. Okay, so importantly, half of us here have not put our hands up, and that's not surprising, by the way. Okay, so that figure is, to put it very simply, the science tells us that from the time of the start of the Industrial Revolution, from the time we started burning oil, coal, and gas, that the amount of warming the planet can cope with is either 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, right? There's a big debate about whether, and Paris Agreement that's one of the biggest fights, because anybody here from the Pacific Island states? No? Anybody here from the Caribbean island states? Okay. Anybody here from the Middle East? Okay. So if you take people who come from some of, like 2015 I was in the Pacific, and before Paris in July. And the slogan that people were chanting in the Pacific was 1.5 to stay alive, right? By the time 6 months later they got to Paris, the slogan had changed to 1.5 we might survive, okay? So let me ask you a second question. So assuming that warming has been happening, how many of you know from that start of the industrial period where we are towards the 1.5 or 2 degrees? Please raise your hands. Don't just raise your hands for now. From the start of the process of us burning fossil fuels towards 1.5 or 2 degrees, where is the warming at this point? How many of you know? Okay, there's about 10 people. Okay, now I'm going to shock you by telling you we've shot 1 degree already. And at 1 degree, my dear brothers and sisters, in the last decade, we have had more than 100% increase in extreme weather events. And you will see it in your own, even if you live in the global north, if you look hard enough, you can see it. But in Africa, I can tell you, every country that I go to, people will tell you things like, the rain is coming when it shouldn't, it's not coming, everything has been disrupted. We are seeing parts of Africa being depopulated and so on. So, bottom line is, and I say it as somebody who's been in the environmental movement, even the environmental movement is in denial about how close to the climate cliff we are. We are 5 minutes to midnight, and some of you might think this guy is sounding totally crazy and he's freaking us out. But I think there is a terrible sense of cognitive dissonance where we are not willing to actually just open our eyes, check out what a precarious situation. Because if we do that, then I think we can summon greater courage of how we move forward. And part of what that is, where's the optimism today in the world? And I want to say that my biggest optimism and what keeps me going is young people. Young people actually get it. And young people know that they are going to pay the price of the absence of adult political leadership that we are seeing today. And young people, so to young people here, and my brother Paul, who got you to stand yesterday, which I thought was one of the most powerful moments for me in the process so far, I want to say to young people here, when adults, or some of us who pretend to be adults, like myself, say to you, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, you have to resist that. You have to resist that, and you have to step forward and take leadership today. Because if you wait for tomorrow, there might not actually be a tomorrow that is actually defendable. But in terms of the business community now, let's be fair that there are lots of people in the business community who actually have reached a point where they know they have to change. And I'll just tell you a quick gossip when I was at Greenpeace, right? If I was negotiating across the table from a CEO of a big company, right, to push them to move in the direction of sustainability, the first thing I would ask my research department to do is not go, before I go into the meeting, is not to go and work out all the business lines and so on. I say, tell me whether this guy has children or whether he has grandchildren, and I'll tell you another secret. I would go in the meeting, and not like dirty research, everything that's publicly available, you know, in the internet, and I will use the names of the children. I said, have you discussed that with Samira, Amira, or Nadira? And they will get, and I'll be honest with you, the CEOs, and this is a scientific fact based on my life experience, the CEOs that had a better chance at actually winning an argument and pushing them were those that were either in the second or third marriages and had much younger kids, right? So basically we have to humanize our economy, we have to humanize the way we talk about the change, and we have to stop, I think, talking about the poor and talking of those that have been marginalized as victims, as beneficiaries, as recipients, and all the aid jargon that we should put in one box and throw out far into a safe place. In fact, very deep, like we sometimes bury nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Right? And so we need a fresh discourse. We have to recognize that a lot of the development orthodoxy that we have used over the years has not worked. We in civil society sometimes are as complicit by actually going along with it, and there needs to be a shake-up. But we need to do this with love, with compassion, and with understanding. Because, you know, this whole north-south divide, you know, is something that we need to get beyond. And that's an opportunity I think climate change offers. Because basically, right, we have lived in a world for far too long that's been divided by north, south, east, west, developing, developed. Climate change puts a different reality on the table. It's saying to us, listen, whether you come from north, south, east, west, developed, developing, we either get this right as rich and poor countries acting together and make the massive transformational changes that we need to make, and we secure the future of all our children, or if we get it wrong, true, people in poor countries are paying the first and most brutal price for the impacts of climate change, even though they carry the least responsibility. But ultimately, all of us are going to sink.
Absolutely.
Or burn.
And I think part of the love conversation, too, is generational. As much as it's very easy, and we've been sort of tongue-in-cheek saying it's the older generation's fault, and the younger generation, to a certain extent, has to solve it already, the reality is, simply by virtue of getting older, one is becoming more entrenched. So I don't want people to feel like we're beating up on folks who have been in this space for a long time. The reality is you have been in a system that has taught you to think the way that you think.
Absolutely.
And so young people don't have those structures and those...
they're fresher lenses.
Exactly, and that's what gives them... It's not simply because they're young, it's because they haven't lived that life as yet. I want to use one of our Slido questions. Keep Slidoing for sure, but Francis asks, you've talked about the need for diverse media. Where do you get your news from, and what are your go-to sources?
Well, you know, increasingly I'm reading broadly what you would call community media. These are news generated by activists on the field. I mean, I watch all the mainstream media because you need to know what your enemy is saying. So I'm a little bit of a news junkie, but okay, I'll be blunt about it. I think today, somebody said to me the other day, actually, you know, the two best channels that you have today is Al Jazeera and Russia Today. And then I said, yeah, Al Jazeera is really good for everything other than what happens in the country they're located, and Russia might be very good other than what's happening in Russia. But I think also, you know, the problem with community-generated media is that there can be failings. You know, sometimes people get caught up in enthusiasm.
That's an understatement, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be fair, given that they're doing it with so limited resources, and quite often it's not done with active manipulation as we see with
Oh, not at all.
with dominant media. But you know, I think this question is a key question: whether we can be able to get people to understand the urgency of the moment we're in, whether we can move people to act with the urgency and so on, will depend on our ability to communicate. And I think that if you look at, for example, one of my inspirations has been the resistance of people in Arab countries against authoritarian rule that we saw in 2010. I don't like to use the word Arab Spring, which is used because I think the struggle for justice is not a seasonal activity. But
I'm sorry, that's amazing.
No, and people who were involved in the so-called Arab Spring say that we were involved in a struggle for human dignity, and they don't like it captured like that. But if you look at that, how did people mobilize? They were able to work through the most authoritarian media environments, right? And as they say, you know, we use Facebook to organize, we use Twitter to tell people where to go, and then we use YouTube to say people, oh, that's what we organize. Now I'm simplifying it a bit, but I think we are in a communications revolution. We need to think outside the mainstream media, but I would urge people, if you think we're going to win the communications war by only using social media and ignoring the mainstream media, then you are in denial about how powerful the mainstream media is. Can I just quickly make a point about measurement?
Can I say no?
So, no. No, sorry, no, I just want to make, because how do you measure, you know, how do you measure your impact?
But before you get there, this answer that you've just given, which I completely appreciate, and I love the fact that community media has become something that people go to, I think is emblematic of exactly the issue, because everybody in here trusts that you trust who you're reading, so it would be great for us to actually hear who you're reading so that then we can go do that too, rather than sort of generally saying, let's, you know, look for new sources. So who do you actually read?
I mean,
Specifically. Actually. So they can Google it right now and start following those people.
If you're from Africa, I say go read Pambazuka. Okay, anybody from Africa, anybody heard of Pambazuka? It sounds like a weapon, but it's an intellectual weapon.
I'm going to get really serious now. Spell it. So
Pambazooka, right? So that's just one out of many, right? But let me also say that why I don't want to give a whole list. It's very contextual, right? Sometimes, depending where you're working, you're going to look at, you know, and a range of NGO news sources I would trust with my life, right? So if I'm looking for a human rights situation, I will look, like right now in Cameroon, where there's a catastrophe in 2 of the provinces, where government has cut internet for 3 months, and people have been arrested and charged with terrorism. The Civil Society Consortium ban. I'm sure none of you know. How many of you know there's an issue like that in Cameroon at the moment? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Actually, better than I thought. That's good. I've just been there on a Africans Rising fact-finding mission, and the situation is absolutely dire, right? But for that, I will go to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and a few African human rights organizations, because I know the quality of the research and so on. So it all depends on where you are working and, you know, the issue that you're tackling, and you just have to make the time to research that. And of course, sometimes I use some UN sources, which where I know that powerful governments have not manipulated the outcome of what goes there. So because we know the UN is not beyond manipulation either. So sometimes, you know, some of the UN sources, statistically, especially on, say, the UNDP statistics on development and so on, I find reasonably good. And for Africa, we now have a news source for the last 10 years, which is called the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index, which I think is probably one of the highest quality sources on African development.
That's brilliant and super helpful. And I think even well-meaning news sources can be manipulated unintentionally, as we talked about, and in some cases, unfortunately, intentionally. So it's incredibly helpful to, just as a reader and a consumer of news, be active as well, to be paying attention. We'll get to metrics, I promise, but I want to make sure we do 2 more quick questions from the audience. The first is, how is Africans Rising doing things differently or taking an innovative approach to the SDG agenda?
So one is, we're building this movement from bottom and beyond borders. So the one thing is, and I can link the question to measurement, and a point that was made yesterday, because yesterday there was a lot of focus on the importance of having good national policies. I fully support that. Right? While I fully support that, I think it's important to understand that assuming tomorrow every African government, all the gods in the world came and made them angels, and they were totally non-corrupt, they were totally efficient, they were totally effective, they reduced their consumption patterns themselves and became absolutely angels of leaders, right? And they adopted all good national policies. How far can they go when certain global policies are unjust? And so if you take the global trading regime, just as one big example, we've had this Doha development round that started in the 1990s and still has not yet been satisfactorily completed. And when we have a global trading system that still benefits the developed countries versus developing countries in terms of market access, agricultural subsidies, and I don't want to bore you with the whole list of things. How far can you go? So how many of you heard the slogan, think globally, act locally?
All of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what was behind that was what you were trying to do at the local and national level, you had to think deeply about global discourse, global power, global narratives, and what that allowed you to do or not to do at the local and national level. But then, it always takes a brilliant woman in the feminist movement, Devaki Jain. She stepped forward in the 1990s. She said, hang on a minute, if we think globally and we act solely locally, but real power on many things, trade, climate, even the pricing of pharmaceutical drugs are moving from the national to the global level. If we as people in the global south, if we only act locally, then we're removing ourselves from where real power actually resides. And she said, maybe what we should do is think locally about what our needs are, and if real power is at the global level, we need to act globally. Sadly, we don't have the luxury of doing one or the other. We have to think globally and think locally, and we have to act locally and globally. So that's what we are trying. That's what we are trying to do with Africans Rising. Please, if you visit the website and you see the Kilimanjaro Declaration that was adopted in August last year, which is gearing us up to a launch on 25th of May, what we are saying is a lot of the problems on the continent do relate to our historical legacy of colonialism, but we're saying to our leaders, you cannot use that as a permanent excuse. And we're also saying to ourselves that given that many of our countries don't make an economic, cultural, linguistic, environmental, or any other sense, that's a reality that we are left with from colonialism, but we are going to build unity across those divisions that have been left. So I jokingly, been saying for a long time, if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. And so...
It's true. It's true. You can clap for that.
So basically, we're trying to change and also the last thing I would say, we're trying to change dependency. We are in a dependency culture. So like, for example, even when there's a human rights abuse, the first voices of solidarity are coming from our brothers and sisters in the United States and Europe. Not to say we don't appreciate it, we do deeply, but that gives an excuse to our government to say foreign interference, imperialism, colonialism, and dismiss it. So what we are saying, for example, as Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity, when there's a problem in a fellow African country, the first people that need to step forward and show solidarity should be fellow Africans. That's why when Jammeh in Gambia was refusing to leave, Africans Rising was there in a context of repression to stand with civil society, and that's why we were in Cameroon 2 weeks ago, to make sure that the first people that step forward and show solidarity and build unity are Africans supporting Africans. And of course, we welcome the solidarity from people elsewhere, but if we don't stand for each other, we should not expect or deserve others to stand for us.
You guys, we're free to clap. It's okay. So we're going to wrap in just a moment, but where do we go to find out more about the campaign on May 25th in particular, and also about... the organization wholly.
Let me just say, just Google Africans Rising and Kilimanjaro Declaration. Can I make the measurement point quickly? So
you have 30 seconds.
Okay, so we need to be accountable. Those of you are involved in it, I know that you are being put under a lot of pressure to come up with measurements for each of the different, not just the goals, but the sub-goals. Please take care, I want to say, that this doesn't become what consumes and gobbles up most of your time. As Albert Einstein once said, not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured counts. And as a feminist in South Africa said, in the middle of a debate about what actually is rural, you know, is peri-urban rural, she got up in a big conference in South Africa and said, folks, it's useless spending time on defining rural exactly what it is, because rural is like pornography. You might not know the technical definition of it, but when you see it, you'll recognize it. So trust yourself that if you are moving in broadly the right direction, there will be evidence weekly, monthly, and so on that will tell you that we're on the right track. So please do not make measurement and investment in measurement another whole industry in the development context. Rather, let's have more money going to people who are on the ground, who are fighting on a day-to-day basis for social, economic, and environmental justice. Thank you.
Oh, now he wants to know what to do. I love everything about this conversation, and especially because we're doing a fun transition, guys. It's like the Golden Globes. Especially because one of the things that's amazing about talking to anybody who's in this space at this conference is people's brains are incredible, right? The amount of things that you are holding in your hearts and in your heads all the time are literally staggering at a lot of points. But I also think that's the challenge that we have, because we are staggered by how much is in our brains. It is hard to communicate about it. And that's why I pressed you on what you are actually reading in the morning, because I think it helps us to kind of almost tip sheet a lot of this for each other so that we can communicate in a way that's actually helpful.